All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So going off of what Steve said, um, I wanted to share a PowerPoint template that I created for an organization. And the way he showed you is one way to do it, but when you get into the industry of what I am into, graphic design, you're going to be asked a little more of what to create. So this PowerPoint, of course, is done in PowerPoint. This organization has redesigned itself in terms of the brand elements that are created, and so they hired us to kind of shape and use this guide to create their new image. And so I'll quickly show you by starting at the very beginning some of the things that I've included in this PowerPoint that the organization can use is transitions to the slides. And a lot can be done using different transitions, right? And of course, you can overdo transitions and different elements. And one of the things that I like to do with PowerPoints is starting off any organization as their cover image with their logo or their slogan. So for this one, it's the MB3 logo with the slogan, Healthy Kids, Healthy Futures. So to take it a step further, I actually deconstructed the logo. And for the transition, so whenever the organization is ready to start its presentation, the logo, in a sense, appears animated. So the arrowheads are going to fly out in either direction, and the logo will fade away. So if you look at the screen, you'll see the transition. Okay. So aside from that logo transition, the next click that happens is rather than fading out and actually like dissolving, I wanted this to have more of a movement to it. So there's a transition applied to this slide that pushes the slide up, right? So if you can look at the slide now, the elements that I've included are the graphic elements, rather than being on the top and the bottom, have now moved to the right and left. So readjusting the graphics is really important. With this, I always want to make sure that the logo appears on the slide. Again, you don't have to do this, but the logo is on every slide. That little line is sort of the divider between the logo and the title of the slide. So the next slide is just another example to show the movement. So whenever the next slide would appear, it's like a continuous film reel. And then the last slide, of course, moves in a different direction, and you have the basic information, the logo again, and the text. So to kind of see how this was built, I can show you what I did, and then we'll move from there. So here's a basic view of what normally displays when you create a template, right? So another way to adjust templates is, if you are in your PowerPoint now, you can go to View, and the options that exist are Normal, Slide Sorter, Page Notes, Outline View, Presenter View, Slideshow, and then Master. So in the Master, you can actually see your slides. So if you click on Master and go to Slide Master, you'll see, if you look up here, that I've adjusted all of the slides so that these are my sort of template holders for how I want to use any combination of images with text or media. So I've personally gone in here and actually adjusted how my title is going to display, right? So if you look at the example here, I manipulated the length of this box, right? So if I click to the right, I can resize this box. So as I move this box around, it'll basically show how this appears. So to view your master slides and you want to adjust which options to choose from, this is the cover slide, right? Or the end slide. Here's a blank one just to be there. Here's another one with the title and no content in the bottom. Same thing with the title, and then a 2-column layout. And you'll notice that on the bottom there's footer options below. So in PowerPoint you can actually adjust all these modifications, again, by going to View, Master, and Slide Master. So to view back the template again in its normal view, you would go to View to Normal. So again, just an example of how that's created. I'll go and show sort of the animation that I did. If looking up here, you look at the title cover and I click on animation, you'll notice that each of the graphics have a number associated with them, right? This little 1, 1, 1, 1. So to add those animations, I had to have separate images, and I'll show you what they look like. One of the things too that I recommend when you're building custom templates, and even though Word or PowerPoint will save images within the document, I always attach those images as their source in case, again, if we moved from one computer to the next and something didn't copyright, then it can relink itself. So here's the bottom arrow, right? These are all the elements I'm using. The bottom graphic, the arrow to the left, the actual logo, the logo without the arrowheads, right? The right arrowhead, the top arrowhead, the triangles on the left, the bottom, the right, or excuse me, left and right, and then the top, right? So, yes?
Basically, you just took a bunch of images and just added the slide transition effects on it.
Yeah, and that's the part that you can become proficient in terms of building your graphic ability, right? Because in order to do that, I needed to have the source of the logo, meaning it's not a JPEG and I'm tearing it apart. I'm actually working from the designer's file who created this, so I can actually separate each element, right? So if you were to try to do this with a JPEG, that would be impossible. I mean, not entirely impossible. You could take it into Photoshop and delete the areas you didn't want, but it works better when you have the source. What's that? Yeah, so all the images I'm using are PNG files, which retain the transparency. So you're not seeing a white border, right? So if I open this back up again, I'll show you quickly. And I open the triangles. See how we have sort of this gray? There's nothing here. So if this was a JPEG, that would be white, right? JPEG will always save whatever you think is transparent to white. So again, if you're working on a black background template and you've saved it as a JPEG, it's not going to retain that color, right? So if I want it to, and the client came back and said, well, actually, we want the background to be black, right? So we could go in here and formulate just how you guys did by adding the picture, change the background, but because my images are PNG with the transparency, the images, everything that you see on screen that's white would become black, right? If they wanted it orange, everything that's white would be orange, so it would be see-through. Cool? And again, just to share some real-world templates that are created, and again, this is something that the organization is using. Right, so once I've given it to them, they can add their slides, and if we look at this and go to home, and as soon as they click on slide or click the drop down, you'll see that in here all of my templates with the graphic elements built in are there for them to choose. So if they want it to do a 2-column comparison template, there it is. So you want to make it as easy as possible when you're designing for organizations that they're not having to recreate things. All right. So I'll close that out. One other thing that I wanted to share with you guys is just how, in terms of designing a presentation, it can be challenging, right? So what I've done is I've kind of given you a little, or I'm going to show you a little cheat sheet that I use. And before we get started, when you start with a default template, right? When you're designing custom pieces, it's good to know, as I mentioned, the size of the canvas, right? So if on your screen, if you go, or in PowerPoint, go to Design, and if you maximize the presentation on your screen, so you're not kind of pushing it together, squishing it, but you see all the options, there is an option called Slide Size. If you click on slide size, you'll see that it's set to widescreen 16:9 ratio, right? So how this is important is if I click on page setup and I'm designing graphics to have a specific height, I need to know what that ratio is. So by clicking on page setup, you'll see that widescreen has these measurements of the width at 13.3 inches and the height at 7.5. right? Say I knew that the presentation was going to be designed on a projector just like the one here in class, and it's not a widescreen angle. And the difference before I move is if I push presentation mode, what you're looking at is, if you look at the white, it's like a widescreen TV, right? You get the black bar on top and the black bar on the bottom, okay? So if we were designing for this screen size, I could click on standard, which is 4 and 3, right, as a ratio. If I go to page setup again, it's 10 by 7.5. So the height is always going to be 7.5. The width is what changes, right? So you want to know what the width is, so as you're creating graphics or picking images, then you can decide how you're going to display it. So if I click OK here, and I click on the presentation, we should have a solid square. See how I'm taking up the full projector versus a widescreen, black bar on top and black bar on bottom? Okay, so that's, again, a key thing to know. As you're designing in PowerPoint with what we're using in class now, it defaults to widescreen. Yes?
So you're kind of saying it's important to know what kind of screen you're projecting on?
I think it's important because I want to be able to, for me, take over the screen. If I'm using a 4.3 ratio, right, and I'm projecting to a square image, basically, more or less, I'm using as much of the canvas as I can, whereas if I switch this to widescreen, I'm sort of losing my space, right? Because if I go back into the presentation now, you'll notice I'm losing the bottom and the top, right? It's just something to be aware of. Your images might appear smaller by going on a widescreen, right? Because now it's kind of shrunken and moved itself down. It all depends on style. That's all I'm saying. Okay. So what I've created for myself, and I can share this so you can have it, is if I insert a picture, when I'm creating templates, I always will create a grid. So I've created this grid, and it's actually designed so that when I am viewing it and creating a template, it gives me columns. Okay, one of my favorite designers is Wim Krauwel. He's a Dutch designer, and he basically uses grids when designing fonts or posters or basically anything, because he's a designer that likes to create order, right, or have order on the page. And if you've designed your PowerPoints last week, I don't know if it was hard for you to figure out where to put images and text. Maybe it wasn't, but some people I did see kind of just putting them together. The way that the grid system works is on the very top I have space for a column, right? A column for the header. And then in this square, this could be an image or text, an image or text, an image or text. And I've put another line in sort of the cyan color, or sorry, magenta, down the middle to show me the half of that region. And this might be boring, but it actually kind of helps. So for example, if I was going to insert a picture and I had to resize it, I can use this grid to help me determine how big it should be, right? And if you see, if that was an image, I do have an option to size it to half of that square, or I can size it to that, and now I'm creating order. So if I was going to create a text box with text, remind me later. And I remove this. Oops. Let me add my text box again. I can use this grid so if it was removed, it shows a sense of order, right? So there's equal space between the edge and then the space between the image and the actual text. Does that make sense? So it kind of is a way to help you lay things out or organize your information. So again, a grid. So I have 2 grids that I created. So again, the one that you looked at was for a widescreen setup, and I also have one for a standard. (10 by 7.5). So again, this just helps me visualize the screen to organize the content that I'm given, right? So again, using the column system helps to kind of organize your thoughts or your layouts better. Cool. So let's get to the fun stuff, the animation. All right. So on your screen you have a picture, an image of IAIA LTC building. If you've typed in your ad title, right? So just give it a name, right? There's a couple of options. If you want to put a subtitle, you can. I'll just put Santa Fe, New Mexico. Okay. So in order to animate text, you have to select the text. So you should see the bounding box around that text. Then you want to click on animation, right? And then once you click on animation, the menu that falls below it, you'll see appear, blinds, checkerboard, dissolve, and then if you click the little drop down arrow, you'll see that you can scroll through all of the options that are there. So for this example, let's just put in fly in. You can choose another one if you want, just to see what happens. And as you build your animations, it'll show you what it does. What also opens is another side bar with animations and your options. So if you click on the little play button where it says play from, you'll see that the text flies in, right? And next to it is a number. So the way that the animation works is based on order. So if we want to add more animation, like to animate Santa Fe, I can then choose a different build if I want it to, and this one is peek-in, and you'll notice that that now says 2, right? So when we looked at my animation for the logo, I wanted them all to kind of take off at once. So the way you kind of achieve this is if I click on Santa Fe and I click on timing as one of the options down below the order where it says effects options timing text animation, if I click on timing, the first option that comes up is start, and that's on click. So what that means is if I go into presentation mode, the moment I click on my arrow to move the slide, right, I comes up, and then my second click is Santa Fe, New Mexico. So if I wanted them to come in together or Santa Fe to come in with the first one, I can change that order by, for one, putting it with previous. So if you notice that the number where Santa Fe in the order structure is, it's changed from 2 to 1. So if I go back to my presentation view and I test it and click, you'll see that they both come up together. Okay? So there's different options in how you want to design this. Again, I usually will put all my text out before I even get into this part of the presentation because this is the fun part. You'll notice too that with the start there is a duration. So it's at a half a second. If you click on that drop down, you'll see that there's a 5 second, 3 second, 2 second, and 1 second option along with that half a second, but then also you can have a custom time. So depending on how you're animating this, you can actually control the time that it comes in. You can also repeat or create a delay. So you can repeat it twice, 3 times, 4 times, or a custom one, or until next click. So if we clicked on that option and once it started, then it'll keep going until you did your transition. So again, depending on the type of animation that is required, these are the options you have. So below timing is text animation. If you click on animate text, you'll see that there's by word or by letter. So when I first started designing PowerPoints in middle school and high school, Everyone used to do this by letter option. So if you click on by letter and then go ahead and view your PowerPoint presentation and click, you'll see that each letter, right? If you look at Santa Fe, they all kind of float in. You can also do that by word. So if we go and view it again just to see the option, they came in Santa, and then Fe came up, the comma, then New Mexico. So again, those are sort of the options that you have. You can do it in reverse order. So that's basically how that works. But again, I usually always use at once, because for me, using like the words, depending on what effect you're trying to go for, when I showed you guys a presentation, when I wanted to kind of showcase the typing in that Google search bar, I did it by letter so that it looked like somebody was actually typing in versus everything kind of coming up. So again, when you're designing your PowerPoints, just determine which effect might work best for you. Under effects options, this is where you can actually determine which way the text is going to come into your slide. So right now we have it coming from bottom, right? So if I click from top, and if you click the play button at the top, you'll see that it's going to come from the top. And if you click on from left, it'll come from left. If you click from right, it'll come from right. There's also options to change different animation options, like changing, for example, we could say we want it to have Santa Fe changed from black to orange. So if I do that, I could change after animation, have the text change to orange. So if I view and play, see how Santa Fe changed from black to orange. So I'll just do this as a larger projection so we can see it. So Santa Fe changes to orange, and that can be useful if in your presentation you're highlighting, say, percentages, right? And you want the audience to key on, say, 80% of students in this class all have cell phones. And to kind of accentuate that, you can change the color of the font without having to create a special command, and you can simply do it by going into effects options and selecting after animation and change it to the color that you want. You can of course add sound, right? So this is the part of what I was saying where this is more or less like middle school type presentations, by adding sound effects, unless it's important to the presentation. We can, I don't know if we can hear it, let's see. So this would be like, I clicked on applause, right? So again, it just all depends on how you want your presentation to be viewed. I normally don't use sound effects, but if you want it to, there's your options. So that's animating text. You can do this to any part of it. If we had, say, bullet points, right? You can have each bullet point come up as you're talking through your presentation, so you're not displaying all of your information right away. You can do it by having each bullet point come in, and that's where you would do the options, right? You can do groupings as well. So if you look at it, all paragraphs at once, that would be everything displaying. So those are your options that you have. The next type of animation that I want to share is transitions. So before we actually do a transition, let's add another slide. So go ahead and just, if you click on this drop down, you can choose another option. You already have one there. So for me, I'll just add second page and then more information. Okay. So if we wanted to add a transition like the MB3 PowerPoint I created, where everything kind of just moves up, right? We go to transition. So on the top menu, you'll see home, insert, design, and then transition. So with that option that I did, I actually used push. So push is one of those options that allows you to decide which way you want it to go. So if I click on my second page and I clicked on push as an example, it'll show you how that can happen. If you notice on that same menu bar, you'll see duration. we can set how fast and how slow that's going to happen. You have the option to add sound again. So I'll say 2 seconds. And then click on mouse is another option. So the moment you click on your mouse or your arrow keys on your keypad or the space bar, it'll actually animate. So that's how you want that to do the animation. If you click on the after option, you can actually create a time delay as well. And then as you can see, you can apply that transition to all your slides. So if I click on apply to all, it's going to animate all my slides to push. So if I click, so the animation allows me to have that animation. Did you guys all see that? Yeah. So of course you can play with all the other options. Again, depending on what you're trying to do, you can kind of stylize this. And I usually, like I said, do this at the very end. Because for me, the content is more important than the transitions and the animations. It just makes things look modern by adding certain effects to it. And again, that simple push transition always is like timeless, I think, in terms of displaying information. But you can play with all these other options. Fade is also another option. The cut is very just straightforward. Morph. You can see what happens when you click on that. It gives you a little display of how information can be used by using Morph. Again, so as Steve had mentioned, a lot of professionals are using this in sort of the very beginnings of how they want, for example, it's like storyboarding, how to create. Here's kind of the transition we want to make from camera 1 to camera 2, right? And how animation could work and before it goes into production. So again, using these kind of options can kind of make your presentation a little better, but again, it's focused on the content first. Any questions?
That's cool.
Yeah. So what I would do is kind of see what all these transitions do, and that's what I always do with any software that I come across. I like to just see everything and play with everything so that when it comes to actually designing, I know what's possible and what's not possible. So I guess that's all I have. So go ahead and with your 4 slides that you have up, try to create a transition using the options you have. Add general text to it and see what happens, and you can always view your transitions by clicking on your slide and going to the icon to the presentation mode, or by going and clicking on your text and clicking the play all button if you're working on text animation to see what happens. But it's always good to test your animations and see how that works.
So on your 4-slide presentation, add title text as well as body text. So you have your title, for example, here is second page, and then you have body text. And it can be just random text, but you should have 4 slides worth, each with 3 lines of text.
Just be about anything?
About anything. So I'm just putting in random numbers here.
Do we have to keep the IAIA?
You don't have to keep that. You can drop something else in if you want. And something to think about also with text is that you want to design your presentation and think about the size of the room in which you are going to be presenting. And what I like to enforce upon people is think about if you're using just text on a page, you should have no more than 4 lines of text. In a room this size, you'll note where it says second page, even when I view in this screen, the farther you get away from the screen, the more difficult it is to read the text. So in general, you want no more than 4 lines of text to a page. And a good way to think about it, depending on the font that you're using, is the smallest that text should be around 32 point. So if I have this text highlighted and I'm at Calibri body and I bring it down to 32. And in a room this size, most people, when they view it in presentation mode, will be able to read it. But you want to be aware that if you have a whole paragraph of text on here, you're going to end up reading from the presentation, as well as people in the back aren't going to be able to read the text and why have it there in the first place. So you even want to think about type size. And then in design, remember I talked about when you're putting something on the web that you should try to use sans serif fonts. What is a serif? Yeah, they're adornments on letters that give a font a distinct look. So if it's a serif font, it has the different adornments on it. Sans serif means without the adornments. And in general, for presentation, you don't want to use serif fonts, and for the deploy to the web, you don't want to use serif fonts. They may work okay for titles, but you don't want the body of your text to be serif, because your eye will blur all of the serifs together and make it more difficult to read.
That's another thing, a good point he brings up, because occasionally we work with an organization in Albuquerque that works with children with special needs. And so when you're designing PowerPoints, serif fonts often are difficult for them to read because of the tail ends. When they're close together, for them, they see one image, or they tend to run together. So it's better to use a sans serif so there's a separation in letters. Because if the kerning is too close, then it just looks like one long object, I guess.
Yeah, and kerning in typography is the space between letters and words, as compared to leading, which is the space between lines of text. And that goes back to the old days of typesetting, when you were using movable type, that in order to make various lines of text justified or not, they used to put little lead spacers in between the lines of text as well as in between words. So what you're going to do is you are going to have your 4 slides all with copy on them. It doesn't have to be this background image. And you will have your text as well as any images if you use animated, as long as it's not the background. And something to think about in design and presentation. Don't use a transition or an animation just because it's there. If you're using it, it should be to accent something that you are presenting. There was a phenomenon back in the at the beginning of the new millennium, where actually there were various universities and institutions that actually outlawed the use of transitions, little sound effects and the like, the little bells and whistles, because people were overusing them and they were becoming distracting. So the only time you use transitions, animations, sound effects and the like is when it's going to accent the point you're making. Don't use it just because it's there. So don't take the salad bar approach. Don't eat it just because it's there. Once you have your 4 slides with effective transitions and animations, submit that to the in-class assignment.